All right, let's now look at the refutation of Gorgias. We're going to do two different but obviously related things here. First, we're going to look at the passage and just piece together how exactly it's working, how exactly the refutation is working. And then the second thing we're going to do, we're going to examine, in some sense, whether or not it was a good argument, whether Socrates' refutation of Gorgias is good. One of the things we're going to see is that the refutation Socrates draws it out of Gorgias. Socrates gets Gorgias to admit or to accept a series of claims that are inconsistent. And so, what we're going to look at in that second part is whether Gorgias should have admitted those things. Why did Gorgias admit all those things? Should he have taken them back? Could he have taken them back? And so on, right? That's what we're going to be looking at in the second part. Before we get into the refutation proper, so you can find the refutation in that passage, 459d to 460e. Before we turn to it, I'm going to display the passage up on the screen in just a second. I want to talk very briefly just about Gorgias's account of rhetoric. Prior to 459d, really, the whole chunk of the dialogue, so 447a to 459 or so, that whole chunk of the dialogue, it's a discussion between Socrates and Gorgias, in which the main object that Socrates has in view is eliciting Gorgias's view of rhetoric. And they go back and forth, right? And so Socrates asks him a bunch of questions. What do you think? What's rhetoric concerned with? And Gorgias says, "Oh, speeches." And then Socrates says, "Well, wait a minute. Doctors make speeches, so to speak, too. They say things to their patients and so on. And so rhetoric has to be more specific than just making speeches." And so Gorgias says, "Yeah, it is. It's about, it's not about medical or health related things. It's about justice and so on." And they kind of refine through this question and answer, through these questions and answers, they refine the account of rhetoric. And Gorgias's eventual ultimate account of rhetoric is that it's a craft. We're going to talk about that at some detail later when we turn to Socrates' own view of rhetoric next week. But Gorgias thinks rhetoric is a craft, like an art or a science that produces persuasion about matters of justice and injustice in large gatherings. That's the view. Now, you might think, and so they spend all this time getting that out on the table. And so your expectation might be that Socrates' refutation of Gorgias is going to consist of an argument against that view. It's going to consider, you might be led to expect that Socrates is going to argue that that view, that account of rhetoric is incorrect. But that is not what in fact happens. Socrates' refutation of Gorgias leaves that conception of rhetoric kind of alone. It doesn't really deal with Gorgias's particular conception of rhetoric. Rather, the refutation draws out an inconsistency in various things that Gorgias has said about rhetoric. And so, in addition to drawing out this view of rhetoric, from Gorgias, Socrates also draws out a series of other statements concerning rhetoric, and it's these other statements that trip up Gorgias that constitute the refutation. And it's these other statements that Socrates gets at in 459 to 460e. So let's look at that now. So there's the PDF, 459d. Starting here, around 459d, Socrates kind of makes a bit of a break. Whether the rhetorician is or is not inferior, blah, blah, blah. We'll examine that later if it has any bearing, right? So we'll put that to the side. The thing we were just talking about, put it to the side. For now, consider the following question. And what's going to go on here is Socrates is going to kind of present this refutation all of a piece, right? And that's what we're going to get here. So he starts off with this kind of long question, but the question itself is not that difficult to understand. But here's Socrates. Is the rhetorician, and so consider the following question. Is the rhetorician as ignorant of the just and unjust, base and honorable, good and evil, as he is of medicine and the other crafts? So just previously, we saw Gorgias' account of rhetoric. The rhetorician, it's a craft that produces persuasion about justice. Well, okay. What Socrates is now asking, does the rhetorician need to know about justice? As a rhetorician, do rhetoricians necessarily have to know about justice? After all, they produce persuasion about justice. And he's contrasting this with something that Gorgias had said earlier. Gorgias had said earlier that, look, rhetoricians can persuade, for example, sick patients to undergo some medical treatment, even when doctors can't. And Socrates presses the point, well, do rhetoricians know about medicine or health? And Gorgias says, no, of course not. They don't know about that kind of thing. Nonetheless, they can persuade sick patients, even when they don't know about medicine, right? And so that's a pretty cool thing that rhetoric can do. And so Socrates is saying, well, look, okay, rhetoricians persuade about justice. Do they have to know about justice? Does he devise persuasion concerning these things, concerning justice, so that even though he's actually ignorant of them, he appears, at least among those who are ignorant as well, to know more than someone who actually knows? So is the rhetorician ignorant of these things, ignorant of justice? Or is it necessary for the rhetorician to know these things? And must the prospective student of rhetoric, the people, Gorgias, that you're trying to teach, must they know these things prior to coming you in order to learn the craft of rhetoric? And if they're in fact ignorant of them, will you, the rhetoric teacher, not teach him these things when he comes to you, since that's not your job? And will you then make him appear to most people to have knowledge of these things when in fact he doesn't, and to seem good when in fact he isn't? Or will you be unable to teach him rhetoric at all unless he knows the truth of these things? What do you say about all of this? By Zeus, Gorgias, I wish you'd reveal me the power of rhetoric. You're just saying you would. Now it's a big, long thing. All Socrates is really asking, do rhetoricians have to know about justice, or can they be ignorant of justice, right? Gorgias, you're a teacher of rhetoric. And so if you have a student who's come to you to learn rhetoric and they don't know justice, do you have to teach them justice as part of their training in rhetoric? Or is that irrelevant in the same way that teaching them about medicine would be irrelevant to teaching them about rhetoric? Right? So that's the question. Well, Socrates, I suppose that if the pupil does chance not to know them, so if the student doesn't know about justice, he'll have to learn these things as well from me. That's what Gorgias is saying. So if a student doesn't know about rhetoric, or doesn't know about justice, a rhetoric student doesn't know about justice, me, Gorgias, the teacher of rhetoric, I'll have to teach him about justice. Socrates, say no more, for there you're right, Gorgias. If you make someone a rhetorician, that person must either know the nature of the just and unjust already, or must be taught by you. Certainly. All right, so that's the first claim that Socrates gets Gorgias to admit to that's ultimately going to lead to Gorgias' downfall. Part of an education in rhetoric will be teaching students knowledge of justice if they don't already have it. That is to say, all rhetoricians possess knowledge of justice. Because the idea here is, why does Gorgias have to teach knowledge of justice if the student doesn't have it? Because that's part of what it is to know rhetoric. You can't know rhetoric unless you know justice. And so an education into rhetoric is going to be an education into justice. That, at least, is what Gorgias is saying. Right? So there's the first claim. That's not a refutation yet. So let's turn back and see where it goes. Okay. Now Socrates starts something new. Well, isn't he who's learned carpentry a carpenter? Well, yeah. Carpentry, of course, is a craft. He who's learned the craft of carpentry is a carpenter. And he who's learned music, a musician. Yes. And he who's learned medicine is a doctor. And doesn't the same hold true with the other crafts? He who's learned anything whatever is that which his knowledge makes him, Gorgias. Certainly. Back to Socrates. And in the same way, he who's learned what's just is a just person. Gorgias, to be sure. Socrates. And a just person may be supposed to do just things. Gorgias. Yes. And isn't a rhetorician necessarily just? And doesn't a just person necessarily want to do just things? Gorgias. It appears so. You can sense a bit of hesitation now in what Gorgias is saying. So back to Socrates. And so a rhetorician will never want to do unjust things. There is a second admission that Socrates elicits from Gorgias. If someone has knowledge of justice, then that person will be just. Right? That's in the part that I just read. That's what Socrates gets Gorgias to agree to. If someone has knowledge of justice, then that person will be just. And Socrates gets Gorgias to admit to this through a series of examples. That's what the carpentry thing is doing, the medicine, the music, all those examples are supposed to support the general principle. Then if you have knowledge of a craft, then you are that which the craft makes you. If you have knowledge of music, then you're a musician. If you have knowledge of medicine, you're a doctor. And he wants to say the same thing holds true in justice. If you have knowledge of justice, well, then you're a just person. And Gorgias says, yeah, sure, fine. These first two claims, claim 1 and claim 2, together, and this is what Socrates draws out, together they imply that all rhetoricians are just. Because what the first claim says is that if you're a rhetorician, then you possess knowledge of justice. It's necessary to having knowledge of rhetoric that you have knowledge of justice. That's what the first claim says. And then the second claim says, well, that if you have knowledge of justice, then you're going to be a just person. Well, in light of the first claim, all rhetoricians have knowledge of justice. And so all rhetoricians are going to be just people, right? That is straightforwardly and logically implied by those two claims. All rhetoricians are just. Okay. Still, we don't have a contradiction yet. And so this is where Socrates goes in for the kill, so to speak. And so a rhetorician will never want to do unjust things. Gorgias, no, clearly not. Here's where it comes. Here's the refutation. Socrates, but do you remember saying just now that the trainer isn't to be accused or banished if the boxer makes a wrong use of the craft of boxing? So what Socrates is alluding to here is something that Gorgias had said earlier. Earlier, Gorgias had gone on for a bit about how, look, you don't blame the boxing teacher if the boxing teacher teaches someone boxing, teaches a student boxing, and then that student goes off and uses the craft of boxing in a bad way, right? Goes around beating up little old ladies or whatever, right? You don't blame the teacher of boxing. You blame the guy who went and did that. You blame the student, the person who misused, so to speak, the craft of boxing. That's who you accuse or banish, blame, punish, not the teacher. And then Gorgias makes the point, and this is what Socrates goes on to say, right? And in the same way, if the rhetorician makes a bad and unjust use of rhetoric, that isn't the fault of his teacher, who should accordingly not be banished, but the wrongdoer himself, who made a bad use of his rhetoric. He should be banished. Is that not what you said, Gorgias? Yes, it was. Right? So earlier, Gorgias had made this point. Just as you don't blame the boxing teacher, don't blame me, Gorgias, if some of my students go around making a bad use of rhetoric, using rhetoric, this super powerful thing, for bad ends, right? Gorgias has just been kind of talking up the power of rhetoric. It can do anything. You can persuade people about all kinds of stuff, right? You can persuade sick patients to take medicine. You can persuade people in the assembly, people in courtrooms, right? Rhetoric is super powerful. He's kind of been talking up rhetoric, and you can kind of understand why Gorgias would be doing that. After all, well, we'll get to this in a second, he's a kind of salesman for rhetoric, right? So he's been talking it up. And part of that, though, is he wants to kind of distance himself from any blame that might go around because people misuse this great power. That's what Gorgias was talking about earlier, and Socrates now is reminding him of that. Back to the passage. So right at E, 460E, Socrates. But now we're saying that this very man, the rhetorician, the person who learned rhetoric, would never have done what's unjust at all. Gorgias. True. Socrates. And at the very outset, Gorgias, it was said that rhetoric was concerned with speeches, not about odd and even, but about just and unjust. Yes? Yeah. Well, when you said that, I thought that rhetoric would never be an unjust thing, seeing as it always makes its speeches about justice. But then, when you suddenly added shortly afterwards that the rhetorician might make an unjust use of rhetoric, I was surprised and thought your statements were inconsistent. And so it was then that I said that if you thought as I did that there was a benefit in being refuted, it would be worthwhile to go on with the discussion. But if not, I would drop it. But now, as we subsequently examine this question, as you see for yourself, the rhetorician has been acknowledged being capable of using rhetoric unjustly or of having any willingness to do unjust things. By the dog, Gorgias. It'll take much more than a short discussion to get at the truth of all this. And at that point, the refutation is finished. And what do you see? We see Gorgias doesn't say anything. Polis jumps in. And this is where the discussion with Polis begins. So let's turn back now to this refutation here. So what's the final piece of the puzzle? The idea that there are unjust rhetoricians. 1 and 2 imply that all rhetoricians are just. But earlier, Gorgias had straightforwardly implied that there are unjust rhetoricians running around, right? Yeah, there are unjust rhetoricians running around, Gorgias said, but don't blame me, Gorgias, their teacher, for them, right? No, that you blame them. They're the ones making an unjust use of it. Don't blame me for what they're doing. Blame them. Well, that idea very clearly implies that them, the people you should be blaming, are unjust. That some of these people that Gorgias has taught rhetoric to are unjust. That's a contradiction. Gorgias has said, in effect, that all rhetoricians are just, but that some rhetoricians are unjust. Both of those things can't be true, right? If all rhetoricians are just, then there can't be any unjust rhetoricians. And if there are unjust rhetoricians, well, then it simply can't be true that all rhetoricians are just. And so Socrates has gotten Gorgias to refute himself, to contradict himself, to land himself in a contradiction. And there it is. Right? So that's how the argument's working. Now the question is, why does Gorgias admit to all these things? Should he have taken one of those 3 claims back? What Socrates has very clearly shown is that those 3 claims are mutually exclusive. You can't accept all 3 of those claims. And Gorgias does, and that's why Gorgias refutes himself. But is there one of those claims that Gorgias maybe shouldn't have admitted to, should take back, should deny? Start with the 3rd claim. There are unjust rhetoricians. Maybe he shouldn't have admitted that. That's not gonna fly though. We saw that idea in the first place. It was part of kind of Gorgias's insulating himself from blame. And so he clearly wants to do that. He doesn't want to be blamed for when his students go off and do terrible things. And so if he's going to try to defend himself from being blamed for that, he's going to have to say something about how they're unjust rhetoricians. But more generally, he can't deny 3 because it's just obvious, right? Rhetoricians were the politicians of their day. Right? When they're talking about rhetoricians, they're not really talking about teachers of rhetoric like Gorgias. They're talking about politicians. Gorgias would train politicians. That's who would learn rhetoric. And so these unjust rhetoricians, it's just obvious that they're there. It's obvious that there are unjust politicians. And someone who would deny that there are unjust politicians, well, they're just trying to sell you something. They're not interested in the truth at all. It's just an obvious truth. That's like denying that grass is green. Clearly, there are unjust politicians. And so Gorgias can't deny 3. Well, then what about 1 and 2? Why does he admit those things? Most people would think that, I think most students, when they read this, 2, why think 2 is true, right? If someone has knowledge of justice, then that person will be just. I mean, can it be the case that you know something is wrong, but nonetheless you do it? 2 would deny that. But it seems obvious that you might know that something is wrong, but do it nonetheless. I mean, it seems obvious that you might know that cheating on a test is wrong, but people still do it sometimes, right? They know it's wrong. And so maybe 2 is wrong. So why on earth does Gorgias admit to that? That, interestingly enough, is not what Polus is going to focus on. Polus is going to say, yeah, Gorgias, you tripped yourself up. You made an admission that you shouldn't have made. Polus is going to say you shouldn't have admitted 1, that rhetoric necessitates knowledge of justice. You should deny that. That's Polus's move. And we're going to see this when we turn to Polus, right? And so Polus is going to say something like, fine, you've refuted Gorgias, Socrates, but you haven't refuted me because I don't admit 1. I don't think 1 is true. I don't think rhetoricians have to know what justice is, right? But so then why does Gorgias admit to these 2 claims? Why does he admit to 1 and 2? I think to understand this, and to understand why this might in fact be an effective argument, even though those claims look like they look questionable, it's important to understand the context. It's important to understand where they are. So, the discussion between Socrates and Gorgias is certainly going on between Socrates and Gorgias, right? They're both there. They're talking to each other. But they're not the only people there. So in the first place, right, Chaerephon showed up with Socrates, and Chaerephon's in the background just kind of listening to everything, seeing what's going on. So Chaerephon is there. But we also know that Polus and Callicles are there as well. They were there at Gorgias's presentation. They're there listening in. Those aren't the only people there, however. Gorgias had just finished giving this presentation to prospective students. All those prospective students are also there, listening in on this conversation. That's the setting. The setting of the Gorgias, they're right outside Callicles' house immediately after Gorgias had given his presentation. And all of the people who are at the presentation, which is to say all of these kind of ambitious, aspiring young Athenian citizens, are gathered around listening in to Socrates talk to Gorgias. That's who's there. And that's the context in which the conversation between Gorgias and Socrates takes place, right? All this stuff about, well, what is rhetoric, blah, 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 right? All those people are around listening in. Yeah. And so when we get to some of the central claims of the refutation, we need to bear this in mind. Right? So let's focus on one of the claims that we were just looking at. Right? Socrates asked Gorgias something like, if your students don't know what justice is, right? So if all the people gathered around, right? Let's say some of them, right? This is are you going to have to teach them what justice consists in? Or would you be able to give this immense power of rhetoric, this power to get people to do anything you want them to do? Would you also be able to give that to unjust people? That's essentially what Socrates is asking. Gorgias undoubtedly knows, or is undoubtedly aware of the fact that he is in front of a bunch of potential pupils. right? He's trying to sell rhetoric to these people. And he's gone on for some time, and I'm sure this was part of his presentation, about the awesome power of rhetoric. Well, if he could teach rhetoric to people who don't know what justice is, that would look kind of shameful. That would look really bad. Well, I mean, Gorgias, you're going to give this incredibly powerful tool to people who are bad? Isn't that bad for society? Isn't that bad for the world? Aren't you having a detrimental effect on all these different cities? You're releasing a bunch of right powerful tyrants, aspiring tyrants out into the world. I don't want to come study with you, Gorgias. This looks shameful. This looks terrible. I don't want to be in, I don't want to have any part of this. Right? That would be what people would think if Gorgias didn't go this way. And so Gorgias kind of has to say, well, no, wait. Yeah, if they don't know justice, I'll teach them that as well. I'm not unleashing a bunch of unjust, powerful, aspiring tyrants off into your... No, I'm not doing that. I teach people about justice too. Everything's wholesome. Everything's on the up and up. I'm not unleashing these violent, powerful tyrants into your city. That's not what I'm doing. That's not what I'm about. Right? He has to say something like that in order to sell rhetoric to these students who are kind of on the fence about it. Like, yeah, maybe I'll go learn from Gorgias, but maybe not. I don't know. Imagine it like this. Imagine you apply to law school. And I mean, you're a really good student, say, and you get into a bunch of law schools. And so you go around and you visit these law schools prior to making your decision of where to go. And you go and ask the law professor who's giving you a tour of the school or whatever. You ask them, if I don't know, what do you guys do here? You kind of teach people how to, the law professor gives you a whole spiel about, oh, we're going to teach you how to be amazing in court, and you're going to know everything, and you're going to know the law backwards and forwards, and you're going to be so successful in your court cases and so on, and in your practice of the law. It's going to be great. And then you ask them, well, look, okay, that's all fine and good. You'll teach me all these skills. But what if, like, I'm a bad person? What if a bad person came into your law school, an unjust person? I mean, are you going to give them all these skills too, so that they can manipulate the law and win their court cases? And I mean, is that how this law school works? That law professor who's trying to sell you on the school, right, is not going to say, oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. We'll teach anybody. Yeah, if you're a horrible person and you want to use the law to your advantage and manipulate it to your advantage, yeah, absolutely, we'll teach you the law. No, they're going to say, no, we don't train lawyers like that. We, no. We teach lawyers about justice, and, we make sure everyone's good, right? And he'd do this, the law professor would do this as part of selling the program to you, because if the lawyer didn't, right, the program would start looking kind of bad, kind of sketchy. Like, really? You just train like mafia lawyers to help, or something like that? No, that's no good. Yeah. And so they're trying to sell the school, and that's exactly what Gorgias is trying to do. Right? So returning back to the refutation, Gorgias agrees to both of those first two claims, I would say, out of, quote, shame. That's the way Polis puts the point, right? He's too ashamed to admit the truth, which is that neither of those things are true. Likewise with this law professor trying to sell you on law school, right? Too ashamed to perhaps admit that, no, we don't teach you how to be a good person. We don't teach you to be a good person. And yeah, we'll teach bad people. We'll give bad people all this power if they pay us, right? Well, that looks really shameful. That's embarrassing. You don't want to say something like that out loud. And so Gorgias, just like this law professor trying to sell you on law school or whatever, says, no, we make people good. Right? And so he agrees to those things out of shame. He's forced to agree to those things given his position as a teacher of rhetoric, given who his audience right now is. He has to go in for those, both of those. Of course, I teach you about knowledge. And yes, of course, if you have knowledge of justice, you're going to be a just person. I don't have, I'm not doing anything dangerous. Yeah. And so he agrees to these things out of shame. And so he's really trapped. When you read the Refutation just on its own, you might think, well, look, Gorgias just should deny one or two. But if he does that, well, then he's got a big problem. Rhetoric looks like a shameful business, or it looks like what he's doing is perhaps very shameful, right? And he doesn't want to paint it in that light because he's trying to get these students, right? That's the idea. That's why the setting matters for understanding the arguments. And so now we can also make sense of how the rest of the discussion between Socrates and Gorgias proceeds, right? So at some point in the discussion, Socrates kind of announces, hey, Gorgias, I found an inconsistency in what you're saying. This is pretty much immediately after Gorgias had went on about you don't blame the boxing teacher for the boxers going around beating up old ladies or whatever. And Socrates says, look, I found an inconsistency in what you're saying. We can either drop it and be on our merry way, Socrates says, or I can point it out to you. I can let you know. What do you want? What do you want to do? And what does Gorgias do? He kind of says, well, yeah, it's getting late. All these people were just at the presentation and they're probably real tired. They don't want to hear us talk anymore. Let's just be on our way. It's very clear Gorgias is just trying to get out of it. He knows he's trapped. He knows Socrates has his number. He doesn't want to look bad in front of all these people. He's trying to find a way out of it. It doesn't work, however, because everybody else, Callicles and Polus included, chime in saying, hey, no, we're not tired. We'd rather just stick here. There's no place we'd rather be. Keep going, right? And so Gorgias, again, is kind of forced to keep on with the conversation. These potential students, these people who, he's got to impress, want him to keep going. So he has to keep going. Right? And that's what then sets up the refutation. That's when Socrates then lays it out for him, right? Shows him the refutation. Gorgias, you've contradicted yourself. Gorgias is just left there kind of stumped. Nothing to say. He's been embarrassed in front of all these potential students. He's got nowhere to go. He's got no outs. He can't do anything, right? And he, instead of getting mad at Socrates, he's kind of humbled. He's silenced. He's, oh, okay, right? Whereas a lot of people, when Socrates would do this, they would get mad. That's not really Gorgias's reaction. He's just kind of maybe embarrassed, kind of humbled. Yeah. And he stays silent for much of the rest of the dialogue. He chimes in every now and then, but he is just kind of silenced and humbled by Socrates. Now, last thing I want to talk about, what all of this shows, what this refutation of Gorgias really shows, is the way that Socrates' refutations work. And we're going to see Socrates make an explicit point of this later on. Socrates refutes specific people. He's not as interested in abstract philosophical theories. He's interested in abstract philosophical theories in as much as people believe them, in as much as they structure or organize people's lives, as they inform the way people live. Plato and Socrates are interested in not just abstract philosophical theorizing. They are interested rather in what kind of person would believe certain abstract philosophical theories. They're interested in what kind of life certain abstract philosophical theories give rise to. And so Plato takes abstract ideas, takes kind of general philosophical ideas about the point of life or what a good life consists in, or about what's right and wrong, about what's valuable. And he examines them in the flesh, so to speak. He looks at people's lives that are beholden to these theories. He wants to see what kind of life the theory would give rise to. And in the case of in the case of the refutation of Gorgias, what we see is we see one kind of life that might be lived if you thought rhetoric was the most important thing to study. If you thought rhetoric was the greatest craft, what kind of a life would that belief give rise to? Well, one kind of life is Gorgias's. And that life, what Socrates has shown, is inconsistent. It can't be consistently lived, right? And so this belief that rhetoric is the greatest craft, that that's what we should devote ourselves to, gives rise to an inconsistent life. It can't be consistently lived. And what we're going to see as the dialogue proceeds is that that belief is really just a kind of entailment of a more fundamental belief. The more fundamental belief, which we're going to see come to the surface, is that a good life consists in doing what you want. And so in the Gorgias, what Plato is examining is the kind of life that would be given rise to by the belief that happiness is simply doing what you want. Happiness consists in doing what you want. What kind of a life does that give rise to? Gorgias's life is one kind of life that that belief might give rise to. And what Socrates has shown is that that life is inconsistent. What we're going to see as the dialogue proceeds are kind of more frank or honest manifestations of that life. We're going to see more frank and honest embodiments of this idea. Gorgias, in a sense, can't be honest with himself. He has to kind of lie to himself. And that's how he trips himself up. He can't admit to himself the truth. Polus has less of that. And by the time we get to Callicles, and Socrates makes a point of this, Callicles is completely honest and completely frank and won't shy away from admitting anything out of shame, right? And so Callicles is kind of, in some sense, the most extreme manifestation of this idea that rhetoric is the greatest craft and that happiness ultimately consists in doing what you want.